This is the PhoneGap 2.0 talk. Once you announce a 1.0, everyone's like, what's next? And this is going to cover it from a really high level. We haven't done any official planning yet, but we have some ideas. So I'm Brian. You can find me on Twitter. And kind of reoccurring theme with PhoneGap that we've had over the last few years is where's our roadmap and what is our roadmap? And we decided to respond to the community demand. We created a wiki page where we basically started dumping all of our ideas for our roadmap. And our community saw this page, and they were like, what the hell is this? And we're like, you can contribute. You could help us fix it. But what they saw was us trolling them whenever we said that. And so hopefully this is something that we're going to be able to change in the coming year. It's important to us to have a good roadmap and to have a solid future for PhoneGap. So first thing, native scrolling. That's what we're going to add for PhoneGap 2. Maybe I'm trolling David Kaneda a little bit with that one. Okay, so some perspective. When we consider what a release is, we want. Am I okay here? Am I too loud? Use my inside voice. Is that better? Okay, cool. So some perspective on a software release. There's goals and principles, and then there's practices. A principle might be something like revision control is a good idea. A practice would be use Git or SVN or something like this. So in PhoneGap, our goal has always been to embrace the web as a platform and to treat web technology as a first-class development environment. One of the kind of fuzzy areas of PhoneGap that people have really latched onto is that we always start off with the idea that we wanted to cease to exist. And it sounds nihilistic, but the idea is actually that we wanted to provide a roadmap for browsers. And so these principles in practice, we've been using the onboard SDK and web view that ships with all the platforms so that we know there's a web view there. We want to augment it with a bridge back to the native code using a foreign function interface style programming plugins like Dave showed, and to provide a prototype for the future of the web. So all software goes through a life cycle of sort of three sets of questions that everyone asks themselves. And the first question everyone asks is this even possible? You know, and then the next question is it going to be fast? As soon as you're developing software, usually the first implementation is kind of slow. And then the final part is, can this thing actually make any money? It's funny how that always ends up being the last thing. In the case of PhoneGap, we actually started with this is a valuable idea, being able to distribute code to all these platforms, being able to overcome the obstacles of multiple different disparate operating systems. There's a lot of value in that. And so that was immediately apparent to everyone. That's probably a good idea. But what we weren't sure of whether or not it would work. But eventually, with some help, it did work. And that's pretty good. And then the last question a lot of people have been asking is, can it be fast? And these days, it is pretty fast. I don't think it's as fast as it could be, but with PhoneGap Android, I know Bryce has tested this, we were getting something like 100 operations a second. And so that's more than good enough for a start. I've always loved this cartoon from Hugh MacLeod. The market for something to believe in is infinite. And so when we first started the PhoneGap project, we had a plausible prototype. But today, we actually have something that really is worthwhile. And the reason that people latched onto it wasn't because our code was good. It was because the idea was worth chasing. It definitely wasn't because our code was good. So 1X has been all about device APIs. And we always wanted to hit all the major platforms, as many as possible. It became immediately apparent that there was some shared code happening between different platforms, and that's where the plugins implementation came from. And then sort of the final piece is better tooling. The web has pretty crummy tooling. Mobile web had no tooling 3 years ago, and today that story is a lot better. So 2X has a lot more goals, or a lot more principles. We want to thin out the client. We want to look at more platforms. We want to add some platform UX concerns, so things that are applicable maybe only to a particular platform. We want to continue adding better tooling. We want to look at performance, and we want to look at polyfilling HTML5 features. So thinning out the client takes the work that we've done in 1X for plugins and takes it to the next level. Being able to create a pluggable interface to anything that is native is good, but there's still some problems that remain. Right now, an Android plugin is intrinsically completely different from an iOS plugin. And that makes sense. They're completely different package formats. And so we want to come up with a standard packaging format. But once we have a standard package for a plugin, it's going to make automating installation way easier, and discovery as well. Once we have plugins fully fleshed out in this manner, it's going to make runtime security even easier. And so this is going to be a real big deal and probably one of the immediate concerns for Nitobi's side in 2.0. The idea that you would be able to choose which interfaces you want and swap them out. Today, right now, you get this kitchen sink of all these different capabilities, but you might be building an application that only needs geo and doesn't need contacts and file access and the rest of it. And so you should be able to pick and choose those. You should also be able to pick and choose which standards you want. The old joke is that the great thing about standards is that there's lots to choose from. And it's true. So if you look at the device APIs world, we have the WAC, the wholesale applications community, and then we have the DAP at the W3C, the device API working group. They both essentially create standards for the same thing in a slightly different way. And if someone wants to choose one of those standards for their PhoneGap app, we should enable that. So the future plugins will allow that. We actually have prototype implementations for all these platforms today. We're hoping by the fall that we'll be able to include first-class support for all of these platforms. This is something we're working on right now. So this will push PhoneGap to 9 platforms by the fall, which is pretty awesome. So UX concerns is an interesting one. Some platforms treat certain idioms differently than other ones. And so the canonical example we like to use is the back button. When you're choosing to go back in iOS, you're going to have a virtual back button, most likely in the top left. Most other platforms have another way of doing this. If not a physical back button, in WebOS you have a back gesture. And we sort of support that pretty well today, but there's other examples like notifications. This is a disparate area that we want to handle in a first-class manner across platforms. Better bindings to physical buttons. And then finally, the HTML5 menu element right now is unsupported in all the platforms, yet all the platforms have the concept of global navigation through a menu. And Michael Brooks is actually prototyping something for this today. So these are the UX concerns. Tooling improvements. We love Winery, and we want to see more enhancements come back to that. Something else that we've been playing with is the idea of hot loading code. So when you're doing browser-based dev, you can just hit refresh, and that's sweet because you get this immediate feedback cycle. In the compiled world of native apps, you have to go through a compile cycle, and it's really slow because it's going back to a device. It can take a lot of time, and it's an annoyance. Phil has prototyped something called Hydra, which allows us to hot load web code into an existing compiled app, and we want to bring that back to the platform so that anybody can just reload their code on the fly while they're doing development. And then finally, better CLI tooling. So if you imagine in the future, if you use your config XML to say which features you want, which plugins you want to load, it's going to make it a lot easier for us to automate. And so we can do better command line tooling. I've got a prototype project called Cordova, which allows sort of like one quick click to install and manage plugins. And we're going to bring this forward more in the future of PhoneGap. Performance and security are always huge concerns, especially in like enterprise-style applications. And these aren't necessarily enterprise-style things, but they're all really interesting areas. So WebGL, we're really bullish on the idea of WebGL and having a hardware-accelerated canvas. It gives us access to a 3D context. We've prototyped it in Android, and it works, and it's fast. We want to continue that work and bring it to iOS and BlackBerry and see that as a part of PhoneGap, first class. Dave and I both practiced around with background services in pure JavaScript by binding different engines to the particular platform that we're running on. This would be hugely powerful for developers to be able to access background services with JavaScript. You could imagine a future with Node.js, maybe not Node.js on some platforms like Android. Rhino runs actually quite fine, so this is something we're looking at. Crypto is another interesting area when it comes to security. A lot of the different platforms have concepts of crypto. Dave started researching what the actual implications are of doing more secure applications, but it occurred to us that we can remotely load our logic. And not all the other platforms give you this capability. But the web, this is actually a pattern that we can use. So crypto and remote loading of your logic using a key pair of some kind could be extremely powerful and way better security than you can get with a native application today. So we're going to be exploring that. We've also started looking at ideas of binary transport. So JSON's fast, but binary transports could be even faster. And so there's some ideas that we have there. There's an existing implementation today called AMF, Action Message Format. This is a part of the Flash ecosystem. There's no reason we can't port this back to PhoneGap itself. So that could be pretty exciting. And then finally, there's some stuff that's kind of in HTML5. Not that anyone's really sure what HTML5 is anymore. And some of these things we win by being on top of WebKit, but some of them are just disabled, like sockets. And we want to see this stuff first class inside of PhoneGap. And so we can polyfill these ideas. So the HTML5 menu elements, one example, web workers and sockets. We're starting to see better support in the mobile web. They should be first class inside of PhoneGap. So Cadence. Cadence is like regularity of release cycles. And prior to IBM joining the project, I think we were at 0.08 for almost a year. Since IBM's joined, we've gotten up to about a release a month. This is really good. We want to increase this cadence and have better momentum for the project. I think a major release every year is a worthwhile goal. It's something that we're going to have to plan out, but this is what we want to do with PhoneGap. We don't want to be sitting on a release every 3 years. It's just too slow. So next steps. Courage Wolf. No, it's not really the next step. So it is an awesome picture. So next steps. Sometime in the next week or so, we're going to announce a community forum. We'll set up a go-to meeting. Anybody is invited in the community to join us. We're going to take all these concerns. We're going to start road mapping them out and assigning the authority to figure out who does what when. The big goal would be a major update by this time next year. We could look at PhoneGap 2. We get a lot of traffic on PhoneGap.com, and this is a way that a lot of people could help us and participate by providing blog posts, Twitter, whatever you can think of. We get a lot of traffic, and we'd love to share that with our community. So that's it for 2. I was supposed to be last and say, now let's party. But instead, let's hear about PhoneGap build.